Move the camera here.
Yeah.
And then, oh, yes.
Thank you. Perfect.
See where that little fuzzy is there?
There you go.
Very good.
Should we move the table in a bit? Are we losing some? That's good. Okay. Whenever you're ready.
We're ready. So I'll introduce myself first. My name is Tessier. I'm an apiary inspector with MDAR. I've been an apiary inspector for 5 years now, 6 years. Anyway, I've been full-time since March. I'm excited to give this talk. Most of the talks I give are more how to beekeep and it's all about pests and pathogens and those types of things. This time of year, it's really nice for me to take a break and talk about something that's just flat out fun, no other reason. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I started photography. I'm going to talk a little bit about the technical aspects of photographing honeybees, and a little bit about the artistic part of photography. And then the second half of the presentation, all we're going to do is look at bee pictures. So if you get a little bored with the technical stuff at first, it's coming, right? So I just kind of prompt you, or how we're going to switch slides?
Yeah, I just want to make sure, turn up the volume for those at home.
Yeah.
Okay, I can,
All right, so what qualifies like a professional photograph, right? So one of the things that initially we look for in photographs is quality. And it kind of gets lost these days on the internet, on cell phones, because even the best screens only project about 2 megapixels, sometimes 4 if it's really good. Most of these images were shot at 50 megapixels. So what that looks like to a screen, if you hit the next slide, you can see the amount of detail that we capture looks like that. And you need that kind of detail for a good quality print. You just necessarily don't need it for online use or web use, but if you want to create a nice artistic print, you definitely need that kind of quality. You can go to the next slide. But that's the full picture again, and that's only part of the story. There's a lot more to this. There's a lot of technical challenges with honeybees because they're so small. And there's a good artistic quality too. We need, as a photographer, we really need to capture the viewer's attention. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before we do, one more slide please. I'll talk a little bit about how I started photography. I started photography as a high school student. This is me about maybe 1990, a younger version of me. I'm in the Mount Washington Valley there, photographing landscapes with a second-hand, probably third-hand view camera. It's a large format 4x5 camera.
I have that camera.
Yeah, carrying that camera.
Yep.
So that's how I started. I started as a landscape photographer purely as hobby and a little bit as a student. And you can go one more slide. And then my career grew into a wildlife photographer, and I worked as a professional wildlife photographer for a number of years. I did it for the flexibility to raise my daughter. So I was in the field a lot, but obviously that job, you're home a lot on the computer, marketing things and stuff, and it allowed me the freedom to do what I need to do to raise my daughter. But as you can see, my camera now is a lot more modern than the one I used to use when I was in high school. This is not honeybees, those are moose, and this is Anchorage, Alaska. Been there many, many times, and wonderful moose up there to photograph. When I send home images to my wife of how things are going, this is what she gets. She doesn't get text, she gets pictures, and that's the picture I send to her. If you find any moose, I say, yeah, I got a cow and a calf. So, I mean, a bull and a cow. But anyway, this is about bees, but I just want to give you a quick brief history of what I've been doing. One more slide, please. So initially, when I started beekeeping, this is my wife on the right and my mentor on the left there. And if you know that person is Wayne Andrews, kind of a polarizing figure in the beekeeping world, but he doesn't get out much anymore. I worked hard as a photographer. When I came home, I kept bees to kind of get away from work, as you know, kind of most of you probably do. So the first several years I had bees, I never even took pictures of them. It's just not what I did. I was working hard in the field, and I would come home and keep bees to get away from that. And so the last couple of years, I started working as an apiary inspector part-time, and I started getting more and more around bees, and now I'm an apiary inspector full-time, and I very rarely photograph wildlife anymore due to travel restrictions and things. But anyway, initially I didn't start photographing bees. You can go to the next slide. But it came around, and and then I started to photograph bees for work, for my slide presentations with NDAR, and for presentations to clubs. And of course, with the history of photography I had, I wanted to do the best I could. So I took everything I had, which really wasn't enough, and I had to learn a lot to photograph honeybees. But that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So the first thing you need to be good at photographing anything, doesn't matter what your subject is you need a passion for it. In honeybees, you have to have a passion for honeybees, and you have to have an understanding of honeybees. You have to know a little bit about their biology, you have to know a little bit about their behavior, the timing of events, which is when they brood rear, when they throw queen cells, and when they're going to hatch out. And you kind of have to know what's going on in the hive. You can't look at it from the outside and know what's going on inside, but if you're a beekeeper, you should have a good idea of what's happening there. And the last thing with bees is they feed on things. We like to photograph on flowers. You have to have a good understanding the timing of the blooms, right? You go to the next slide. So the other thing is honeybees are very challenging for photographers. Honeybees are very small, which makes them difficult. They're fast and erratic. And it's the erratic part that makes them extremely difficult to photograph. Because I'm sure you've all tried to photograph bees, and they just run everywhere, and they don't take your direction in any way, right? Because they're so small, you have to shoot at higher magnifications, and whenever you magnify something, you magnify its problems, the difficulty of doing it. And then you're trying to do it with a bail on, and some of you probably gloves on too, and I'll tell you just a quick story. I photographed manatees underwater, and I learned very quickly I could swim very well until I was trying to hold the camera and take a picture. Then I almost drowned. Honeybees aren't that drastic, but when you think you can take a picture, you're practicing in your living room with your camera and your macro lens, and you're doing all that stuff, and then you go outside and you put on a veil and you put on leather gloves. It's different, right? So it gets hard. And again, we talk about the timing of the behavior of blooms. You can't, this time of year, you can't go take a picture of a honeybee doing anything, really, right? Except for maybe if you take a quick peek in your eye, but you're certainly not going to find any blooms or any good activity this time of year. So you kind of have to know what's going on with that. Next slide. So the first thing people always ask me is about equipment. So I'll talk about the various lenses real quick. The two lenses on the left are kind of general use lenses that with most cameras will come with, like a 28 to 70 millimeter zoom. They're pretty standard lenses, good for many things, but generally don't excel at anything. The next slide. So that's those two there. Some will even come with like a macro feature, which helps a little bit, but you'll quickly learn that that like a standard zoom with a macro feature is not really going to be good enough for individual honeybee shots. You go next slide. They are good for general shots too, right? So you can take pictures of beekeepers and hives and things like that. But with those lenses, don't expect to do any close-up photography of honeybees. Next slide. And it's about the best you can get out of a standard zoom lens, that's an entire honeybee frame. It's still a nice picture, but you're not going to get the individual bee. So that's about what you can get out of those lenses. Next slide.
I find myself looking for the queen.
She's not there.
I
Yeah.
want to make a puzzle out of that one.
You're a sadist.
So this is a true macro lens that's highlighted here. It magnifies a 1:1. So it projects to the sensor. It used to be film, but it projects to the sensor the exact same life size that it sees. So it would be like matching a honeybee to the sensor. That's 1:1. And that's about the minimum you need to photograph an individual honeybee. You go next slide. So that's what a 1:1 looks like with a 35mm base camera. And that beautiful red pollen there. And then this one here is I don't know, they still call them macro lenses, but the magnification is 5:1. So at maximum magnification, it's 5 times larger than life. Right? So you go to the next slide. It doesn't work well for honeybees, but that's about the best I could do for 5:1. Those lenses, unlike the regular macro lenses, the super macro lenses, the ones that do the ultra high magnification, they don't even focus. So you have to set your magnification on the lens, and then you actually have to move the camera forward or backward to get it into focus, right? So the lens itself doesn't focus. People use a geared macro focusing rail to try to get things like that in focus. But with bees, they move too fast, they're too erratic. I do it by hand in a method I call spray and pray. I take pictures and just move the camera real slow, and eventually when I get to the back of the computer, the focus plane will be right on one of them.
That's amazing.
But anyway, we all know what that is, right? The roll mic. He's on a drone.
Yeah,
That's the
on
back of the
Larva.
drone. Next slide. So with photography, we have to deal with the aperture of lenses. And real quickly, if you don't know much about photography, a small f number like f2.8 gives a very shallow depth of field. Not much is going to be in focus, which is a nice feature sometimes, but not in others. And you can see in the bottom of there, an f16, a taller f number, will give you a lot in focus. So you can see there with that particular instance, you see just the bear's head in focus at 2.8. That's f16. You get trees and mountains and a lot more in focus. Next slide. But it all comes out of compromise. You'll see on the far left, you have a very small f number of 1.4. It comes with, stops a lot of action. It has a very shallow depth of field if you look at that column vertically, and you can shoot a very low ISO, so a nice clean noise. Most cameras, automatic cameras, cell phones and things like that would shoot down the middle here about at 5.6, where you get some of the background in focus, your action kind of starts to move a little bit, and you get a little bit of noise. And then at we don't usually shoot at 32 anymore, but on this side here, you'll see you get a large depth of field, but look at the motion. The beads would be like completely smeared off, and then you have a lot of noise. So there's always a compromise in the settings we choose, is really what I'm getting at. And if you look at these as columns, there really is no perfect choice, right? The next slide. And then if you shoot at f16 in very large apertures, we have to deal with something called diffraction. So with modern digital cameras, diffraction limited apertures start off at about f8. So after f8 or f11, f16, the images starts to degrade quality-wise, and there's nothing we can do about it. It's physics. It's the light hitting the aperture blades and scattering. Next slide. And you can see at the top of the hive there, that's not exactly lens diffraction, but that's what happens within the lens. The light hits the aperture blades and disperses like that, so you just start to get fuzzy. So we just can't stop down to f16 and get everything in focus without a compromise. Next slide. And when you magnify this tiny little honeybee, at 1:1 you lose 2 f-stops of light. So remember that chart? When you zoom in to 1:1, you have to move 2 stops over because you lost 2 stops of light during the magnification process, which is a huge problem. A decrease in depth of field at 1:1, we have to shoot at f8 or f11 just to get anything in focus. When I shoot honeybees at 1:1, Even at f8, I can get part of the eye in focus and not the other part. And bees have multiple eyes, the ones in their head, so you can, sometimes you can't, it's very difficult to get the eyes in focus, which is very critical for a portrait. And then, of course, all your subject movements are magnified. If you ever try to follow a bee, and not have it move, it's very difficult. Next slide. This is my secret weapon, is a flash. And not only one, but oftentimes I'll use two at once. It adds much needed light, so you can compensate for that two stops of light loss. The flash duration is very fast at 1/15,000th of a second, so it's faster than any camera could ever be, is the duration of the flash. And then you have the ability to control, direct, and shape the light. And as a photographer, those are three critical things. I can control what the catch light looks on the eye. I can control the mood of the light, whether it's soft or hard or harsh. So it does all those things for me, and so I use flash for bees very often. Not always, but very often. Next slide. So you can see, kind of just to wrap everything up, the technical stuff real quick, you can see on the left was done with a flash. And you can see the bees are nice and sharp and still. And you can see, well, it's blocked here, but it says it was done with natural light, with ambient light. And so you can see, with the slow shutter speed. So you can see the movement in the bees, which is an okay image if you want to show the movement of the bees. But if you don't, then you have to use a flash. So, not only is it a compromise, but it's also a choice, right? It's not how we do it. So next slide. This is my macro lens, my camera, and my two flashes with my two modifiers. So when I head out to my apiary to take pictures, this is oftentimes what I'm using. Next slide. So ethics. As a wildlife photographer, there are a lot of ethics involved. As a wildlife photographer, one of the things that I never want to happen is you don't want to disturb the animal or harm the animal in any way, right? And then, to be a little more selfish, we don't want animals, take pictures of animals running away. We want animals looking towards us, right? So ethically, with wildlife photography, there's a lot of that going on. So with honeybees, you have to be a little cautious if you photograph it in the hive, not to have the hive open too long, not to dump the queen on the ground, those types of things. You wouldn't want to chill the bees and things like that. So you got to be a little mindful of that. When you get photographing the bees and you get in the groove and you're so close to getting what you want, you think it's going to come together, you just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. Sometimes you could injure your bees, so you got to be a little bit cautious of that. The other thing about honeybees, which is unique to insects, is because they have an exoskeleton, when they're dead, they look just like when they're alive. So a lot of times what photographers do to manage that fast, erratic movement is to photograph dead insects. They'll pin them and photograph them dead. I have one picture, well, this one's dead, I didn't kill it. I have one other picture of a dead insect, and I'll explain why when we get there. So just a little bit of that going on. So those are all the technical things that I put in my head when I photograph honeybees. And then we'll go one more slide. So technical stuff makes very boring pictures, but as photographers, we really want to engage the viewer, right? So we do that to what we always call is to learn to speak a visual language, right? And the story I always use is I've been to Africa several times to photograph wildlife. And every time I go, I say I'm going to learn Swahili. And every time I go, the weeks before, I practice my Swahili. When I get off the plane and I meet my guide, who I've used the same guide for years, I read him on Swahili. I probably sound like a 2-year-old, right? So I just can't speak that language. Photography is like that as well. Anybody can pick up a camera and take a picture, but it's not really going to say anything, right? So we have to learn the tools that we as visual artists use to say things, right? So we want to capture interest, we want to convey mood, provoke thought, and all the time you have to realize you're creating an illusion, right? This is not honeybees coming out of an entrance. This is an array of pixels, right? So you have to always bear that in mind. It's not really doing reality. So the first thing you always have to watch for is color and what they mean. Reds are passionate. They also can be violence and danger. Green is growth, rebirth, and fertility. That's oftentimes associated with things we associate with bees. Green these days is also an adjective, right? We talk about being green and that sort of thing. Blues, these are all used in advertising. If you've ever worked in advertising, blue is like, they'll use it all the time. Police officers dress in blue to use, to convey the trust, that creates cleanliness and serenity depending on the tone. Blues are very commonly used, very hard to get with honeybees though. We'll talk about that later. And yellows, happiness and optimism, creativity, but you gotta be cautious with yellow. So it also means illness. Sometimes we say illness feeling green, but in the rest of the world they say you feel fever. Next slide. This is would be red, and you can see that kind of, I like to think happiness and that type of thing. Red's passionate. Next slide. This is also red. But you have to be a beekeeper to know this bee is in trouble, right? They did a good job of displaying that with the reds and colors that this is danger. There's something around here. Next slide. And then we have the optimism of green and this regrowth in spring. This picture is actually taken in October. I could convince anybody that it was me, right? Just because of the colors I chose for a background. Next slide. Blue is really hard. That's the best I could do with blue. I've been trying to get pictures with bees with blue forever, and it's just hard. And throughout this slide presentation, I'll show you, I have very few, but I'll show you me making the actual images, which is the next slide here. So it's me dressed up with my camera, and you can see my two flashes. That's how I did the image, just in the sky there. I'm not checking my email, I'm actually controlling the camera with my phone. They had it on the ground, I couldn't see through it. Next slide. There's some yellows. I really like this slide. I think it speaks of creativity, especially when you get close in on the dandelions, you can see the little swirls. Hopefully it doesn't portray sickness.
That's awesome.
Next slide. And so with colors comes color harmony, and this is something that's really hard with honeybees because some of the flowers they land on are really bright and vibrant, and sometimes really kind of weird colors, striking colors, I guess, but when you put a honeybee on it, the color harmony can be way off, right? So there's two things we look for is analogous colors or similar colors, and then complementary colors, which is a lot harder. But this is something most art students get excel in that. And we talk about this type of stuff for hours and hours, but just to kind of quick overview of things we're looking for. Next slide, please. So those analogous colors, they just kind of all match together. It doesn't look out of place. It's long. Next slide, please. And complementary colors, which I did the best I could. I think that's still a little too blue, but you get the idea. One more slide. This is not a honeybee, it's a green metallic bee, but the complementary colors are a lot better in that image than I thought. Now that I photograph honeybees, I also moved on to photographing native bees as well. Difficult. Next slide, please. The last thing we work on technically is composition. So I hope this works. This usually works for most people. If it doesn't work for you, I apologize. But all images have lines, and your eyes follow those lines. The way I can prove that is with the next slide. Those dots should appear to be moving to some of you. Is anybody that not moving? The next one will be better. But so any image that is created will have lines, and your eyes always go up and down those lines. So as an artist, you should know that, and you should put your subject along lines. And that keeps the viewer's eyes interested, even if they're not aware of it. They're subconsciously aware of it. Next slide.
It looks totally different on the screen.
So this is a swarm, and so it has strong lines. You can see the lines of the swarm. So as a viewer, as an artist, what I'm trying to do is get the viewer's eyes to move up and down the swarm and make it look kind of like it's moving, like it's big. Even though it's happening subconsciously, we're still trying to capture the viewer that way. Next slide. And that's what happens when you put it in the swarm. You add one. And that was a big swarm too, it took 2 beeps to fit it in. I digress. Next slide. So this generally works a little bit better for most people. It's the same concept. Whenever there's a circle in an image, your eye just goes round and round and round and round all the time, right? So this is actually still, it's not moving, it's just the shadows and the fact that your eyes constantly are going around circles. So as a photographer and any digital artist, you know that. So those are awesome. Next slide. So with an image like this, it's hard not to see that queen, right? I mean, it's right there, and your eye won't let go of her, right? You don't have to play find the queen with this image. Just a little side note, a beekeeping note. This is called a retinue when I do this, and they're supposed to look like an eye, like a retina. So that's a queen and a retinue. One of my all-time favorite bee images. Next slide. Viewpoint and perspective. So real quickly, subtle changes in viewpoint change the way the subject looks in the image. So if you look up at somebody, that gives them power, gives them strength. You notice a lot of world leaders and politicians always like to be photographed from below, looking up. When you shoot at eye level, it gives a good connection to the person. One of my good photographer friends is 6'9". When he photographs people, he almost always does it from his knee, because if he doesn't, he's looking down on them. And so to get at eye level, when you shoot down on somebody, it can work. Sometimes it makes them belittles your subject, but oftentimes it makes them feel like protective, like a parent, like you're looking down at the child. And then also the last two are just unexpected views, and this was a point of view also have a lot of visual interest. Next slide. So this is done with natural light on a tripod. The next slide shows me making the image, but you want to connect with that bee, right? You want the viewer to feel bad for that bee. You want the viewer to feel cold and wet like that bee is, right? So that's a good perspective there. Next slide. Nobody feels bad for the photographer who's cold and wet either.
Laying in the grass.
Actually, it wasn't cold, but it was very wet. You can see when I shoot with natural light, you see I have a tripod there, and that's the ultimate one. And see that fence in the background, my apiary? Just put that in the back of your head for a minute. We'll talk about that later. Next slide. So this is a unique position, right, to try to have somebody feel like they're in the colony, right? So I thought long and hard about this one, to try to get a bee's eye view of a bee, right? So that's what the goal was. Go to the next slide. That's how I did it. This setup is a little more complicated, but basically what that is, there's 2 frames of bees on a frame stand, right? And then you can see I have my flashes up above, aiming down to try to get the light down into the bees. And then the white table to reflect some light. And then I stuck my lens right in there and did the best I could with my equipment, my veil, and all that stuff. I thought the image was successful, and I thought, it's kind of neat to see how things are done. Next slide, please. Last thing I'm going to say about technical part of photography and the artistic part of photography is no matter how hard you try, the highest point of contrast is your subject. Right? So there could be, a grizzly bear in the background here. The subject is the beekeeper. The highest point of contrast is always your subject. And that's hard with bees because they're designed to blend into a lot of things. And so this is just one thing to keep in mind. And I see it oftentimes with a mistake with photographers and honeybees. We talked about the bright flowers before. If the bee is dull, because some bees are dark and black, right? If the flower is bright and the bee is dull and black, the subject is your flower. It doesn't really matter with the bee on there. So next slide. If you get nothing out of anything I said, remember this. You don't take a photograph, you make it. Ansel Adams was like me in the first slide. He was my hero when I was a kid. Never met him, I wish I did. That's the bulk of it. Now the rest is just pictures, and I'm just gonna, as long as you guys want, we'll just keep going through pictures of these, and I'll explain to you what I see. This This was the first image that we saw. You can, like I say, you do this with a standard camera. This is on a high stand, frame stand, and I just take the frames of bees on there. It's a beautiful frame. The bees, made a nice picture of it. We saw this one first as well. This is clover. The other clover image that I show it has a nice circle composition to it and a lot of green, but it's not really about the bee. So this one, I took the clover out of the picture more, and I have a nice leading line in. I really want to highlight the bee more and less of the clover.
Actually, I've got a few questions about this image.
Sure.
Now, how much post work do you do in your
I'm
images?
curious about that.
Do you add lousing blur? Are you burning and dodging?
So generally, all my images are shot raw, and then because raw images are very flat and dull, there's always contrast added, there's always saturation added, always to my liking. As far as burning and dodging, very unusual for me to do that.
Okay.
I say I haven't. I generally don't do any manipulation as far as cloning or fixing images like that. I'm an old school film shooter, and I still choose to just shoot it right, and it is what it is. The term I like is wabi-sabi, which I believe means perfection and imperfection. So as far as like bits of pollen on the bee and things like that, I tend to leave those things in there. So yes, everything has been run through Photoshop, because that's just the way I shoot. But generally, the best I can, I try to stick to just contrast and saturation adjustments.
Sure. And just for the viewers at home, when Paul says he runs everything through Photoshop, that's just standard work when you start with a raw image. He's not photoshopping the image in terms of manipulating it. He's just correcting for color and contrast and sort of, I assume, white balance if you ever screw up. But he's not doctoring it.
So yeah, right. So with the camera that I use, I can shoot raw, which is it's an acronym, but what it means is the file is unfinished. So I go into Photoshop and I can finish the file. I can add the right color and add the right contrast and add the right global adjustments. As far as individual adjustments, very rare. Next slide. We looked at this one before. This is the full image of the moving bees. My attempt was to try to show how much they move. This is actually, in the summertime, how many of you guys have seen your bees on the front of the hive because they're too hot? Bearding, this is bearding. The bees lined up nice and flat in front of the hive, so I had a nice plane of focus. They weren't flying too much, and so I was able to take some time, set up a tripod, and do it. I wasn't very happy with the image, so we'll go to the next one. So because I like things nice and sharp and with a good depth of field, they did a little flash. If you weren't a beekeeper, even if you were a beekeeper, maybe you didn't realize that was bearding. It is hard to get bees like that, so deep like that. But my goal was to get just bees, just nothing else but bees. Because actually, if you look real close here, you can see a little bit of the hive right there. So there's always room for improvement. Next slide. One of my favorite things in photograph is skunk cabbage pollen, when they bring that back, for two reasons. One, they roll in it, and they just come back covered, and I just love it. The second reason is, if your bees are bringing back skunk cabbage, you will get about a 99% chance you'll get to the winter. Because it's getting close to that time of year. Next slide.
Wow.
So back to the timing of events, if you know when your bees are going to be hatched and not to brood, this is a neat image to get. You can still see it has a pupal skin still on it, and the light color. Well, this image I shot first. I was kind of happy with it, but I didn't really like this bee down here. I thought maybe could have been done a little bit better. So next image, I shot this one again. But this one can be better too, because I really like the nurse bees and with it. This one looks lonely to me, and so we're always trying to critique myself and get better at what I do. But it is a very cute image of a little bee coming out. So people's team as well. But next year we'll have new goals. Next slide. Again, circles. I love circles. Right? How can you miss that queen cell?
I love how shiny their legs are. It's cool.
What's the news? Remember the ethics thing I said?
Yeah.
Yeah. This one's dead. It is in Massachusetts, though. It's on my kitchen table. My wife's so happy. So at UMDAR for outreach and education, we reached out to the University of Washington, and we got a pair of Asian giant hornets and murder hornets for our education outreach. So if you see us in our events or whatever, we have two of them you can see. Yep.
Yeah.
This is, I took it out of its case essentially, but he's on a pin. You can't see, you can see his name and things like that. And just real quick, he lends itself easy to the color, right? That's danger.
Yeah.
And then he was lit with a flash on the side, and I did it in a very hard light way to make him look kind of more angry and scary. So there's a lot of, like everything, when you work on a photograph, you think about these things and try to get them to
The evidence is crazy.
Next slide. So oftentimes I use flash, and then you've heard me say sometimes I use natural light. This is a unique situation. This is both. And I don't know, maybe I can't answer this question. This is a question I have for anyone who can answer it. When you shoot bees with a flash and ambient light, the catch lights in the eyes look different from each light source. You can see the flash and the ambient light both look, they have two distinct style catch lights in the eye, and I don't know why that happens. I don't know what the difference is between the flash and the sun. But anyway, you can, because the sun was very harsh that day and bright, which you need to photograph the bees, it also lends itself to harsh dark shadows, so the flash is used to kind of fill up the shadow. We looked at this one before. Very nice image. Water lily. Anybody of you have water lilies near your apiaries? Well, what a necklace was that is. Lucky is what you are. Next slide. So this is the next few slides, a little bit of a progression of how I work and how I do things mentally. But this is a terrible picture. I hope you all see that. But this is my water feeder. I feed my bees water starting, well, another month or so in March. I'll give out water for them. Drink a lot of water in the spring as they constitute their honey. But I like to take pictures of bees drinking water. So the next slide is that. It was taken at an exact setup. That's the exact same day. So the moss kind of soaks up the water, and the bees like it because they don't have to risk it in the ground. They can just get the water off the moss. And did a pretty nice image, but it wasn't exactly what I wanted. So I worked on the setup a little more, and I worked on a different type of moss, and look at the next slide. That's the one I did this year. It's the same exact setup, the same exact metal tin. It's a shorter moss, so they wouldn't drink from the top. And then I, got a reflection going on and some dark things. That was one of my better images from last year. Again, we showed this one earlier. This is the clover with the brilliant green in the background. This one, like I said before about the contrast, this one really kind of isn't all about the honeybee, is it? The clover really stands out. That's why the progression of how I constantly try to improve things. But it's still a pretty image. This is an image that I'll be working on pretty soon now. And it's very early in March and in April. Bees will use their upper entrance more than the bottom entrance. This is a nuke to have, and a little small upper entrance, and you walk out of the check in the apiary, how can you not take that picture? You get the nice circle composition, keeps the eye rolling around the image. As an artist, sometimes I leave a lot of empty space for text, so the image can be used for other things, like copy space, negative space. We looked at this one also earlier, just to take a look at it. Nice yellow. So this is a dandelion. If you want.
It's just buried in there. It's
Yeah,
so cool.
we'll dig in deep. When you look at some of these kind of plain weeds or flowers at a close-up level, they definitely look a little different. I think a little nicer. So the first image was in the spring, and this image is in the late fall. The different flowers, but they look almost identical. And again, with this one, you're just looking at the horizontal lines to try to keep the eye moving through the frame and make the bee look like it's working. It's beautiful colors. This is blue again. I'm going to do better. I use this slide lock because it's the only blue one I have. It's pretty and it makes a nice background, but I think this is something on the table there that I haven't found yet. Next one. Does anybody, like, the bees all have jobs. Does anybody know what
that's a
job
guard.
this is? Like, I'm trying to tell a kid that teach somebody about bees and about guard bees, right? So
Awesome.
that's what they do. When it doesn't matter if you're another insect or a photographer, when you get close, they'll guard you.
That's awesome.
But again, notice how I shot up at him to give him more power, right? Give him strength, make him look bigger, make him look stronger.
Oh, that's amazing.
So this image has a long story too. Most of you have kept bees for more than a year have treated with a former product, I'm assuming. And the bees don't like it, do they? They all come on. So my hives are right near my house, and so I treated with formic one day, and I found like 20 bees on my windows. And that's the way they're looking at me like that. So,
Oh my God.
so I tried to photograph, and of course there was screens and double pane glass, and it just didn't work out. But I had an idea. This is an old filter from the front of the lens. And I just clamped it up and I put the bee on it and get her to stay there.
Wow.
And I did it with the flashes. This one did take a lot of Photoshop to clean up a lot of the dust that was on the glass. But other than that, it's straight out of the camera. One of the things that's kind of unique about this image when you look at it long enough, it's just because you never see bees from this angle, is most people think that the proboscis actually goes in and out. It doesn't, it hinges underneath. You can see the proboscis is hinged underneath there. So they just flip it down and you're ready to use it.
There's a lot going on in that picture. It's amazing.
And you can see their little claws.
Yeah, little lobster claws.
And you can see the
Little
scales on the
wax
bottom.
glands.
Yeah, that's where the bromites like to hide right here.
Yep.
Anyway, I thought that was kind of neat, a unique view of the bee. Next slide. We looked at this one before and how it was made, but just take another look at it. So the bee's eye view, maybe we want to get the viewer in the hive, see what it's like to be a bee. The queen was in there, and I was hoping so hard she would pop her head up. The queen's like this thing, so didn't get the queen. But I was happy that this bee jumped on the backs of the other bees and kind of spread out a little bit. My favorite, I'll look at that one again and again. One of these days I'm going to print it. But it just, the way the circle naturally created itself, it just keeps the eye busy, keeps it interested. It says, the picture says a lot, and keeps the viewer
They're
really
just all touching her.
interested.
Yeah.
So this slide, the slide was made I was doing a project on queens, and I wanted to show a picture of a queen that's failing. It's hard to do in an image, but as an artist, I kind of picked like a dirty brown reddish frame and kind of made it look lonely and sad. So this was designed actually to look like a poor failing queen. Hopefully it came across, but you can see some of the techniques I use with the lighting and the color and the lack of other bees and the choices that were made to try to make it look a little bit sad. Next slide. This is the opposite, right? So I want to show like a healthy, vibrant queen. So we have, the nice pearly white larva and all nurse bees around, and attendant bees, and just looks more vibrant and healthy, right? Just by the choices that were made. Different queen too, but anyway.
Can I go back for a moment? You know, you often can tell experienced foragers from the ragtag, tips of their wings, and they start to wear down. And I'm just wondering if the queen's been so sort of attended by workers over the years, whether her hair has sort of started to rub off, as opposed to a younger queen, it seems to be, and I know there are lighting differences, but just interesting to see some of them.
Well, I will say that the queen in the previous picture was a failing nuke. There was no other reason why that nuke would be failing except for the queen. So she was failing. That's a wonderful observation.
That's great.
So
Whoever can tell me the proper name for what they're doing can take a free T-shirt home in the audience.
Dancing.
No?
Nope, myself.
Anyone?
the 2 points if you could pronounce it.
Passing that, right?
Prophylaxis. It's bee feeding another bee directly, mouth to mouth. No T-shirts for you.
So fuzzy, I already have shirts. They're so fuzzy, they look great.
So that's exactly right. This is prophylaxis, and if you're an experienced beekeeper and you see this on your landing board, then you should obviously quickly know that there's a real big honey flow going on, because they're not even waiting to get in the hive to transfer the honey. The field bees are coming in, transferring on the landing board, and taking back off again. And when there's a good nectar flow on, the beekeepers are in bees, everybody's just happy. So I was just out there taking pictures of my bees. The nectar flow is on, which I probably shouldn't have been doing, but I should just let them.
I like
do their
the
thing.
depth though, because the bees are in the way background too. That's
True.
kind of cool.
Truthfully, I keep bees. Everybody has, but I keep some hives for honey. I always keep 2 nukes just for photography, just so I can always find a queen. And the nukes are small, and so the activity is low, and you get stung a whole lot less in front of a nuke than a full-size hive. So there's a lot of reasons. So I do keep 2 nukes going all the time, just for photography. We all keep bees for different reasons, right? Who gets the honey.
Yeah.
This is
Wow.
nobody photographs drones.
That's awesome.
They're so cute,
He's so
right?
cute,
They look like
I
little
know.
teddy bears. So, I mean, as a photographer, some of the things I did is I got the light source as soft as I could to make them look soft and cuddly.
Oh, that's awesome.
You can see, you can tell what a farmer used for a light source by the size of the catch light. You can see it almost takes up its whole eye. So it had like a big piece of diffusion, and then, in probably mid-June, July, when the drones are really active, you just sit out there and they'll go out and they'll sit on the entrance for a few minutes before they fly off.
He's really cute.
Yeah, it's one of the things as beekeepers, if you decide to photograph honeybees, as a beekeeper, you have unique access to something that not a lot of people get to see. If you're not a beekeeper, you very rarely we get to see a queen or a drone or any of those things. So as a beekeeper, we do have access to things that
The daffodil plant.
probably hot in the summer. Next slide. This was a circle composition, again, that I just love in flowers, but what's really going on here, like I said, we get to see some unique things, and we have a lot of hives in a small area, and the dandelions start getting nectar. This is, you can get on this, there's another bee there. You came and gone. Kind of neat, and you can see, when people say about saving the dandelions that the bees really enjoy them. I mean,
Yeah.
it's proof.
Yeah, there you go.
Don't mow your lawn when the dandelions are up. It's not. So we'll go through these a little bit quicker, but I often have to show for my presentations different things that are in flow and in bloom and being pollinated. Does anybody know what this flower is? I think you're right, but that's not what we generally call it. That's a southern thing, summer sweet. It's pepper bush is what we call it here. In summer sweet, it's right. You can see this bee here is just not that colorful. Not all bees are. So that's, sometimes you have to, you don't always get to photograph the bright orange yellow bees. The dark ones. Smile. Anybody know what this one is? This is the biggest crop in Massachusetts.
Up there.
Anybody know what this one is? This one should be easy if you write it right here. It's Japanese knotweed.
Oh, nice. That's the
Next one. Any guesses?
Apple.
Apple. Yep, some more people got it. It's just back to some swarms, trying to get some blue in there, some greens and blues to try to make it spring-like and stuff. Next one. We looked at that before with the sharp lines. This is a bee fanning in the summertime. They usually fan with their butts to you, but every once in a while they get lucky and they'll turn sideways for you and fan the wrong way. The flash is fast enough to stop the wing beats. Image. And then remember that fence I talked about before? One more slide. That's what they look like on the fence.
Wow.
So I run out there in those dewy mornings in the springtime when they're out getting water off the plastic fence. And it makes a nice foreground because it's a reflection off the PVC. And there's beautiful images with the white and the clip art and things like that, and you do kind of arrangements with cycles and things and things like that. You can string it down and stick it in with anything white. It looks nice and clean. With that, last one.
Oh, those are so amazing.
That's where we are. I think that's where we're going to be on Saturday. So I appreciate all your attention, and I'll take these questions as long as you guys have them. Yep.
So if you have like a 30 degree or so megapixel camera, that gives you some depth, but then I would think that one of the ways of that is to go, to complement that with the seems like, how do you just put all that together? Which more really high resolution photograph?
So I use two cameras. One of them is 50 megapixels, and it's a little bit slow. And I use that when I use a flash. The other camera I use is 24 megapixels, but it focuses very fast and it has a much better high ISO. So I can use that camera more for natural light shots. So I do have two different cameras that I use. But to answer your question, it's all it is. It's just a constant balance and compromise of the equipment that we have and the shot we're trying to get and that kind of thing. Like I said, for an individual shot of the bee, your lens needs to magnify to 1:1. When you choose a lens to purchase, that's a spec that you need for honeybees. And then we do things like we add close-up filters and extension tubes too with that, if need be. Does that answer your question now? And then megapixels, not to get too far off topic, but megapixels numbers matter, but also megapixel quality matters. So individual pixel quality matters, and also number of pixel matters as well. So there's also a compromise there as well. That's why I have one camera that's half as many megapixels as the other. But we went through this presentation, and I'm sure not one of you could tell which camera was which. Now that I told you I use one for natural light, you just go through the natural pictures and you can tell. You know that you need to do it. So it's always a juggling, and it's like I said, I'm constantly learning and constantly getting better, and I'm constantly looking for new and improved ways to do things. And so it's kind of an open-ended, never-ending answer. I'm looking at a new camera now. I don't know if my wife's going to do it. They're not cheap. Any other questions?
Yes. Marty asked, how would ultraviolet light pictures change the photograph? And I know you need to have an ultraviolet light sensitive sensor
Right.
because most of them have some sort of a protective coating in front of it.
I have very little experience with ultraviolet light photography. I've seen the images and they look very unique and they look very cool and interesting to me. I have never done it.
Okay. Do you have an Instagram account? So that we can, nope.
I'm over 40.
How about a book? You should put a book together if you haven't already. Those are,
You'll have to tune
Pretty
into
amazing.
the Aperture inspectors meetings to see more images. Let's see. I think that was the last of the photography questions.
Have I inspired anybody to pick up a camera and take pictures or try
Definitely.
to improve on what they do?
yeah.
I'm gonna pull the camera
Have
out.
I gave any non-photographers a little bit of insight into the process and maybe a little bit of, next time you look at pictures, you'd be looking for certain things, and since somebody shows you,
Composition.
you go to an art show, whether it's photography or not, you'll be able to see kind of what a good artist should be able to do, right? They should be able to pull you in and hold you there, and with color and lines and composition and things like that, it should good for you.
My wife is the photographer, but I foresee a request for a macro lens in the near future,
With FinCom.
right?
Send her some red
So I think-
composition pictures to be mine.
We should
Yeah, that's
do
for
a
my
club
wall.
photography
Thank you.
contest for those inspired to, use the equipment that they have and to take some pictures. And we'll do something, we'll make an announcement. We'll think about it at the next board meeting and make announcements.
Have you or anybody looked at the PBS show, My Garden of 1,000 Bees? It was a photographer from National Geographic, and it's what he did during the pandemic, and he modified a lot of his lenses, and he studied all the bees in his backyard in the UK, and it is fabulous. You really enjoy it. And you know who? I slowed the thing down to watch the credits because I'm a weirdo like that. Sam Ramsey was one of the consultants on it, but he did mason bees and honeybees, all kinds of bees that are just in his backyard. So if you haven't seen it, everybody.
Was that on Nature or?
Yeah, yep. You can probably stream it or look for it.
Search on
It's very good.
PBS.
Yeah.
It's great. It's absolutely beautiful. There are very few honeybees, but the photography, videography is.
Yeah, you'd love it
Beautiful.
because it's all macro,
The show I just watched, which reminded me a lot of the image I made of the bees inside the hive. They were putting cameras on wild animals, like koalas and stuff, and then letting them film that way.
Oh,
I forget the name, it was a PBS special. That was great. Well,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you in a month.
Thanks, Tony.
Can you tell me, Tony, about how many people were online?
We had 36 people online.